I studied physics at Johns Hopkins for my BA degree, and then I got a master's in business administration at the University of Chicago. I got my PhD after that at Portland State University in systems science, which was an interdisciplinary program. And my thesis dealt with a range of both astronomy and geology area, studying a new phenomenon of how the galactic center can affect the Earth through cosmic ray volleys. My interest in electrogravitics, which is Towson Brown's work, began in 1985. I was interested because the physics theory I had been working on predicted a coupling between electricity and gravitation, which is pretty much what Brown was illustrating experimentally. In particular, let's say in the standard physics theory with like general relativity, which is our current theory of gravitation, you have only one polarity to gravity. So masses can only attract, and there's no possibility for gravitational repulsion or anti-gravity. Anything that physicist comes up with that is sort of speculating outside of that framework. Physicists have proposed that there might be some coupling between electricity and gravitation at very high energies, and that's one of their reasons for building these huge particle colliders, is they're hoping to find this connection. If they just look before their eyes, the experimental evidence, there is a connection, but it just normal laboratory voltages that you can generate. Brown had kind of a maypole that he built with two disks that he would charge the disks, and the leading edge of each disk had a wire that would emit positive ions, and the body of the disk was negatively charged. Can you see that? Does it show up well? And he would charge an initial experiment, this type that you see here. He charged it with 50,000 volts, about 50 watts of power, and this would spin around 12 miles per hour in this circuit. And then he is reported to have done a similar thing but larger on a 50-foot course, charging to 150,000 volts, and these were going several hundred miles per hour. So if you can picture about like model airplane speed, model airplanes can go several hundred miles an hour. And this was done something around 1953 in Pearl Harbor, and demonstrated to some top brass from the military. And the subject is reported to have become classified after that. They were so impressed with the results. Some people have said, well, this is due to ion propulsion, that the ions coming off of the front of the craft somehow blow the craft and cause it to move. And there have been experiments done to show this is not the case. In fact, Brown tested his idea in a vacuum. So there was eliminating the idea of ions. And it actually worked better in a vacuum. I was interested because I could explain this with my theory, basically that the positive charges would create gravitational wells, just like our current concept of a gravitational well around a massive object, whereas electrons would do the opposite. They'd create gravity hills, which in effect you'd say is a gravitational repulsion effect. And so if you look at Brown's disk, according to my theory, you get a gravity potential hill, G hill, towards the negative charged end of the craft, and a G well towards the positive. And so there'd be in effect a gravitational gradient created across it, which would tend to propel it forward. Well, I know that in '52 he put on a demonstration to the Office of Naval Research. It's kind of interesting that why would they end up classifying the whole project, his whole concept, a year later, if there wasn't this serious this approach to take him seriously. Well, I believe that there are many ways to create a gravitational effects, or at least the approaches I've heard of are quite different. There's like various ways to skin the cat, I guess. Now Brown was using high voltage charge, and it appears that that technology is used on the B2. It involves using a maser. In this case, this would be a different approach than what Brown was doing. This is using microwaves to create pushes, to be able to push on a distant surface. This is a very well-known technology in the area of optics, and there's a lot of literature on it for use with lasers. But you find nothing in the area of microwaves, and I believe the reason is it's very highly classified because of its ability to be used for UFO propulsion. And the beauty of this is that the microwaves stay in the beam. They don't scatter out. That's the nature of it. So you pump up your beam, in effect, with energy, and it's not lost. It's like you're putting your energy into a tube. It's a resonator. And so, in effect, you could create a craft that's standing on poles. They, in fact, become like solid poles between the craft and the ground. And this is how for example, the TR-3B, there's some talk about this using anti-gravity technology, and it has 3 thrusters on the bottom. Well, this is what the thrusters would be. There have been triangular UFOs. The TR-3B is one of the triangular-shaped UFOs that we've heard about. The UFOs that may be of alien origin, disc-shaped, and some of them may be some that we have created ourselves, probably use this technology. You often see 3 domes underneath. I believe these are actually microwave transmitters for the beams. I think Robert Lazar has spoken about his experience with a few of these devices at Area 51. My first exposure to the discovery that this anti-gravity research was quite a big area, not talked about very much, but that it was a major endeavor by major aerospace corporations. This came from this report, Electrogravitic Systems, which I found very revealing. This is a photocopy. The way I came about this report, I was at the Library of Congress looking under gravitation to see if there was anything closely, remotely touching on the subject of electrogravitics, which I had at that time in 1985 just become acquainted with its existence through some articles about Townsend Brown. And there was only one card in the whole catalog which came close to this, and this was about this report. And interestingly, it was missing from the stacks, and they had to do a computer search, to see where could there be another one. And the fellow said, this must be a very rare report. He says, it's only in one other library in the whole U.S. And I said, where is that? He said, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So I went ahead and ordered it through an interlibrary loan request, and I was surprised that they actually sent the copy to me. It's actually this is red cardboard jacket, and it's bound to the side. And this was produced by a group called Aviation Studies International, which is kind of a think tank in London that produces intelligence reports. And they've been in existence they're still in existence, and this report was dated 1956. And it was basically trying to encourage the aircraft industry to develop Brown's technology, Townsend Brown's electrogravitics technology, with the idea of developing a Mach 3 fighter craft, or maybe even to commercialize it. So instead of taking jets, we will fly much faster with electrogravitics. And they did a survey of the aviation industry at that time, and they named some major aircraft companies. I have here in my book, Subquantum Kinetics, I take excerpts from this study and just name some companies. It says here Glenn Martin, with a former company named for Martin Marietta, which is now merged has a different name. It says, Glenn Martin now feels ready to say in public that they are examining the unified field theory to see what can be done, and so on. Let's see. Then further on, it says here, companies studying the implications of gravitics are said in a new statement to include Glenn Martin, Convair, Sperry Rand, Sikorsky, Bell, Lear, and Clark Electronics. Among companies who have previously evinced interest include Lockheed Douglas and Hiller. And they were calling, the people were writing this aviation studies report, were calling for a Manhattan-style project to develop this, that this was going to change our whole aviation technology. Here, then later in Business Week magazine, they listed an impressive array of companies and institutions backing gravity research, just back in the 50s. And that included Martin, Grumman, Lockheed, Sperry Rand, so on. And also Hughes Aircraft should be added to the list. I do believe that we have technology presently developed in which would allow us to easily navigate the solar system with it. I wouldn't be surprised if we had bases on Mars and the Moon and were regularly going there with these kinds of craft. But let's say there was a Roswell crash, and it is said that the National Security Agency was formed to keep this all classified. Now, something like that is a very emotional experience when suddenly you're government officials and you realize that we've had that there is extraterrestrial life and they have this advanced technology. And when you become very emotional about something, one reaction is to hide it, and then to see how can we use this for ourselves. We've got to keep one step ahead of the other countries. At that time, we had Cold War with the Soviet Union. This was a rationale, was to use it for military purposes. You know, you can think back. Suppose the same thing happened 100 years ago at the time the automobile was developed. I sincerely believe we'd still be driving horse and buggies today, because there would be the fear that the automobile could change warfare. It would mean much higher speed travel, and obviously we should classify this. At that time there wasn't the same mechanism in place for, we didn't have the NSA and this major program to contain advanced technologies. We think of it as a science, as a scientific discipline. It's based on observation and it's open to change. And one thing I've learned, because I have my degree in physics from since '69, at that time I was thinking that it was that way, that it was very objective science. And as you learn more about it and about the people, about the scientists themselves, you realize how much it is a religion. It's very closed it's resistive to changing its fundamental principles, like it has relativity as one foundation, the energy conservation laws and other key foundation, for example, in the patent office. Any chance of a new device coming that could help us to solve our energy crisis problem, which has, it's getting its energy from someplace that the patent examiner doesn't understand where it might be coming from, he immediately thinks, oh, this is in violation of the first law of thermodynamics, which is one of these principles the physicists have set up. Not thinking, well, maybe there is a source of energy that we just haven't discovered. Right now it doesn't necessarily fit into the physics framework. Instead of thinking that way, they immediately reject it, thinking, well, this fellow is a fraud, or he did his measurements wrong. And so it's almost like it's a very religious feeling, where the examiners have ascribed to a certain belief system, and anything that challenges that, they will deny its existence.
I said I was appointed by the governor of the state to attend a congressional briefing, a closed congressional briefing on this topic with people like Edgar Mitchell speaking about the reality of this and what have you. And they say, oh, really? Tell me more. So that's one reaction of my scientific colleagues on a one-to-one basis. Part of this gentleman's problems was he was a civilian but had done a lot of work with NASA on a lot of committees and what have you. And I think his problem was the fact that he hadn't heard about this as being a real subject. And he knew that he was very important because he was on a lot of committees in NASA. And since he was very important but hadn't heard about this thing, this couldn't be true because since he was important, he would have heard about it. You see the logic there? And he sort of said, oh, okay. And so he went on and on and on. But as the conversation went on and I told him more about what I knew and the reality of these things, he got colder and colder toward our discussion. And it started off very warm because we both knew a lot of mutual people. And so there was sort of a coming together in that sense. And I realized afterwards that he was very threatened by this knowledge because what the particular job that he was doing in NASA would be majorly impacted by the knowledge that there are extraterrestrials already here on this planet, visiting our planet, and that they have the ability to travel through space and what have you. And so my sense was that his raison d'etre, the reason that he works at NASA and his ego is sort of wrapped up in this, would no longer be as valid a reason if what I was saying was true. And so he pulled back from me. And then he said a very curious thing. I wouldn't believe it even if it was real. This is a direct quote from his email to me. I would not believe this even if it was real. And then he went on, but if you learn anything more about this, let me know. So you can say, so I was left with this, forget it. I'm not going to, if your mind is so closed that you make a statement, I wouldn't believe it even if it was real, it tells me we have a major problem with scientists in our universities in getting them to accept something different than their paradigms that they're so used to or been grown up with. That's a major problem within our whole universities. Interestingly enough, the students that I've lectured to are far more open-minded than the professors. And I'm a professor and I deal with these people all the time. A couple other points to keep in mind is that the Roswell and similar events in New Mexico in the late 40s allowed certain parts of the U.S. government to obtain downed craft, extraterrestrial craft. Since that time, that was late 40s, it's now 50-some years later, since then the black projects have pumped hundreds of billions, that's hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe approaching $1 trillion, I don't know the number, it's big. It's bigger than Bill Gates, have pumped these untold billions of dollars into researching the technologies, reverse engineering these technologies such as anti-gravity and space travel and a whole bunch of technologies that are associated with extraterrestrial technologies allowing these space travel to occur and other aspects of that. Now, if you've just put in several hundred billions of dollars into something, you can be doggone sure that something's come out of that. And people have told me that we had spent a tremendous amount of money by the mid-50s on anti-gravity. There's anti-gravity literature in the public domain, and there's a tremendous amount going on there. So I've heard from a number of different quarters that we have anti-gravity techniques actually in craft that can fly as discs. In fact, it is my sense of things from a number of different sources that the vast majority of extraterrestrial, quote, extraterrestrial craft that people observe in the United States and other parts of the world are not extraterrestrial. They're actually our military or our covert black ops people. that these are fully reverse engineered. I've seen what are sometimes known as alien reproduction vehicles, ARVs. These are craft that have been reverse engineered, and I've seen some. I saw a craft a few years ago, which I thought at the time was extraterrestrial. At this point, I mean, you can't tell when they're in the distance, but at this point, I think probably it was a V-shaped craft heading down the Santa Barbara Channel, witnessed by somebody else, both of us, night vision, $1,500 night vision scope. And this craft was traveling between 4,000 and 8,000 miles an hour down the Santa Barbara Channel. And Tony Craddock and I witnessed this with night vision. Both of us had night vision. We both saw it at the same time. And it was hauling. And I thought it was actually...
There was a disc escorted by jets in Sedona 2 years ago.
That's, and I was thinking, exactly the one I was thinking of. In Sedona 2 years ago, when I was there with a whole group of CSETI people again, we saw an alien reproduction vehicle escorted by jets, U.S. jets, flying with this object that was acting totally different than the jets. It was silent. It was moving differently than the jets.
Synopsis of the anti-gravity, electrogravitics, and zero-point energy research that I'm aware of. I would feel that recently I just met Bob Lazar and had a very nice conversation with him in Las Vegas. So I feel even more confident of his sincerity and his experience at S4 in Groom Lake, Area 51 for those who are not aware of it. S4 is actually south of Area 51. But the important thing is that from his experience alone, the very convincing picture of very advanced circular aircraft or circular levitating craft becomes very apparent. And this advancement in propulsion and anti-gravity has not been really available to the civilian population virtually at all. We know of work done by Townsend Brown, for example, which actually I recently published in Atlantis Rising magazine. And Townsend Brown specifically proved through his demonstrations on Project Winter Haven that the possibility of providing a unidirectional force from charge separation on a craft, especially design craft, is feasible, and importantly, it also cushions the supersonic braking effect. Electrogravitics by itself is specifically the propulsion effect that's gained by a separating charge on the edge or the surface of an aircraft. And I use aircraft in a very general way to mean spacecraft or any other type of craft. The interesting thing is, from my research, I also feel that there's a magnetogravitics available as well. In fact, Dr. Ning Li in the latest Popular Mechanics magazine has that term used in her research. So there's both options available for providing gravity anomalies, and this I feel is a very viable area of research. Interesting research that now is being suggested by Boyd Bushman from the Lockheed. He's retired from Lockheed, and he describes some of that research that he's willing to talk about, and of course an anti-gravity effect that he's also witnessed and measured. You're asking about the unacknowledged programs, and I first of all would like to describe the fact that many people feel, and including politicians and senators, have been quoted on TV. Recently, for example, The $1 Billion Secret that was aired on the Learning Channel for 2 hours. They interviewed, I believe it was Senator Murkowski from the Energy Committee, and he specifically said this was a waste of taxpayers' money to have covert operations that have developed advanced technologies in this energy or propulsion area, and then NASA is also getting tax dollars to do the same thing all over again. The parallel development, he felt, was a waste of taxpayers' money. I've seen other senators say the same thing. In fact, that particular senator requested information from the president about such covert operations. For example, UFO sightings for decades now have cited the fact that all these craft seem to move in very irregular, fast-changing patterns. And for any craft to do a fast-changing pattern means that they're experiencing perhaps tens of Gs inside the craft if it was a normal inertia-bearing type of material craft. But what's obvious is that they do it so effortlessly and can change direction so quickly that very likely they're not being thrown against the wall of the craft as it's changing. More likely, in fact, from the book that I just read recently, Dr. Paul Hill, who was a NASA scientist, Unconventional Flying Objects, he describes the fact that as you're producing a small anti-gravity force downward, approximately 1 G worth, that the inhabitants, the occupants of the craft, all they're experiencing is a force downward. They can be sitting there very comfortably eating their lunch or whatever, and meanwhile the craft is going through all kinds of gyrations. And specifically using that ground downward force to brake and to bank, as well as to accelerate upwards. I believe the state of the art, just from my own personal opinion, of the covert black project unacknowledged aircraft or spacecraft or circular craft is as Bob Lazar describes. He describes more than a dozen different circular craft that are operational at Area 51. He's seen more than one tested and hovered. I've heard rumors, for example, that we have bases on the Moon and Mars already. It's very likely we do. Because when you think of the fact that if you have a craft that you can get into and travel very quickly with no fuel, this is an important fact.
It should require no forward momentum to get airborne.
I've already ruled out superconducting highways, but there's another silent technology I haven't tried out. And this one requires little more than a few feet of wire, some household goods, and electricity. Lots of it. This is a lifter.
Wow, that really is something.
I've come to watch a group of electrical engineers give it a test flight.
In order for this to work, you have to have some atmosphere or some particles to accelerate.
Right.
The lifter looks unimpressive. Just aluminum foil, matchsticks, and a thin copper wire. But switch on the power, 30,000 volts, and something amazing happens. The voltage is so high, it ionizes the surrounding air molecules, splitting off their electrons and making them positively charged. Once charged, the air ions rush to the negatively charged foil, and we have liftoff. The principle is similar to a rocket. Instead of chemical fuel pushing against the air, though, it's a flood of ions. And with a few tweaks, I think it could get my saucer off the ground.